So this is another in my series of personalized Q&As. The patron Na asked, "What do you think are the critical questions in the anarchist slash libsoc movement today?" I think the real question is, what are effective forms of organization, and how can those organizations develop effective messaging for the masses? I think we need to be asking ourselves how to build very sizable coalitions, as that will be necessary in order to construct a successful revolution. And and also, how do those organizations need to structure themselves both internally, and how do they interact with other organizations externally? So, my impression is this is being answered pretty well by the FARJ in Brazil. But I think there's probably going to have to be quite a bit of experimentation taking place. So I think one thing that's absolutely clear in this process is that it is absolutely going to require a long-term, committed, theoretically unified organization. I think that we tested out the sort of fully disorganized affinity group model for roughly the 80s through the early 2000s, and it had very little effectiveness. It was really good for protests. It was great for direct action, but it didn't catalyze anything that lasted. In fact, what it really led to was a huge amount of burnout. It led to a lot of people leaving the movement, being disillusioned by ineffectiveness. Essentially, the one of the most effective things you can do when you have this protest direct action style is get the attention of power structures. And really, the only attention they got was just people seeing news clips of big protests and riots and all of that. And that's not enough by itself. A riot, if it's going to be effective, needs to come along with messaging. There has to be some knowledge of power structures, what it is that people are even rioting about, right? That's why the George Floyd riots worked so well, is because they knew exactly why people were rioting. They were saying police abolition all over the place. So as this was taking place, it was just obvious what needed to be changed, and therefore the riot served as a sort of point of leverage. But you'll notice that it didn't. The riots themselves, the actual groups and organizations themselves, haven't continued to be substantial forms in the post George Floyd era. Now, the orgs that were formed as actual formal organizations, not as like affinity groups, those lasted. In fact, one of the most significant orgs I'm in was formed during the George Floyd protests, but it does not have an affinity structure. It actually has a formal structure. And so it seems to me we need to be exploring what sorts of formal structures are going to work in a long-term basis. When I bring this up, I'm looking at our two main forms of success, or our main examples of success in the modern era. I'm looking at the Zapatistas and I'm looking at Rojava. And when I look at both of those, they started with vanguard organizations. Okay. Now, I don't want to build a vanguard organization, but what I see was effective about those vanguard organizations is that they stuck for a long time, that they were formal enough that they were able to persist and therefore grow. And therefore, as they became militant, it meant something. And it also meant that as they coordinated their efforts in a unified direction. That matters. Okay, that's a big reason why formal organizations are more effective than a bunch of affinity groups. Affinity groups spread their efforts in 1,000 different directions and barely get anything done, whereas formal organizations stick and actually have a revolutionary capability. So, what are the critical questions? I would say mostly form of organization. How do we mimic our models of success? And how are we going to message successfully to the public?